You're listening to Drug Positive, the risk reduction and benefit enhancement podcast, reducing shame and stigma to save lives and end the drug war. Hi, everyone. In this episode, I interview neuroscientist Matthew Baggott. Matthew's been a friend and colleague of mine for over 20 years. He was an early consultant for DanceSafe, and he's recently founded a company, Tactogen, which seeks to synthesize and market new MDMA-like drugs, or Tactogens. This is a fascinating interview. In it, we discuss the pros and cons of the new psychedelic renaissance, what the mainstreaming of psychedelics might look like, and how it might affect the underground culture, especially with the entrance of big money capitalists like Peter Thiel and the dreaded compass pathways. We talk about upcoming models for prescription psychedelics, including the potential for take-home prescriptions, what the lack of trained psychedelic therapists is going to mean for medical legalization, how the decriminalization movement and growing recreational psychedelic use interfaces with the medical psychedelic movement, and a lot more. I did this interview a few months ago, and what's really interesting to me is that between then and now, I actually had the opportunity to try a new Tactogen that I'd never taken before, 5-MAPB, or 5-methylamino-propyl benzofuran. And I have to say, it was great. I really loved it. It was similar to MDMA, but unlike other Tactogens I've taken, I didn't feel it was missing anything. It was a complete experience. And for me, that's different because when I take other Tactogens like MDA, also known as SAS, or methylone, a cathinone class drug, I always feel like they don't quite get where I want to be. As if the drug is trying to be like MDMA, but just doesn't quite get all the way there. So there's always a feeling that there's something still missing. But with 5-MAPB, I didn't have that feeling. There was a kind of whole emotional component, a complete stress-free state like there is with MDMA. But the difference was that there wasn't that gushing, sort of overwhelming emotional empathy like there is with MDMA. It wasn't mushy, in other words. There was a bit more discernment, I guess. Sort of like you don't feel compelled to tell complete strangers that you love them. One way I like to describe it is that I used to think MDMA was just one effect, like a continuous single effect. Call it the MDMA entactogenic effect, and that other MDMA-like entactogens get you part of the way there, right? So like MDA or methylone always felt to me like lesser entactogens in this way. They only get you part of the way up the MDMA ladder, if you will. But after taking 5-MAPB, I now realize there are at least two distinct effects from MDMA. Because 5-MAPB, at least to me, produces one of them fully. And that would be the stress relief part and the sociability, the sort of removal of social anxiety or all anxiety. It was a stimulation, and there were sort of heart flutters even in your chest like you get with MDMA, puts you in a really good mood. And in this regard, 5-MAPB felt exactly like MDMA. It wasn't lesser at all. And that's something that I don't get from MDA or methylone. So if you can imagine at least two effects from MDMA, one, the stress relief, mood elevation, sociability part, and the other, the mushy, lovey-dovey part, 5-MAPB has all of one and none of the other. And to me, given that I no longer experience either with MDMA because I've taken it too many times, I must say I am thrilled to have discovered 5-MAPB. I'll probably do an entire show about it soon. Anyway, when I did this interview with Matthew, I hadn't had the 5-MAPB experience yet. And so you'll hear me open with some skepticism of him or anyone actually being able to find other entactogens similar to MDMA that are worth it. He sort of convinces me in the interview that he can and that they're actually out there, but how strange that just a few weeks later I actually take one. And now I'm even more excited than ever about the potential to find even more, which is what Matthew's startup is attempting to do with machine learning algorithms, actually, which you'll soon hear about in the interview. So I'm going to keep this intro short. I do want to say that I'm beginning to work on my documentary again after taking 2 years off, so that's exciting. I hope to get it out by the end of this year, and hopefully theaters will be open again, and we can do a theatrical run. And the worst of COVID may be coming to an end, at least here in the US, which means we may see festivals start up again sooner than expected. So that's great. Maybe life will get back to normal sooner than we think. But of course, we need to watch closely what's happening in India and Brazil right now. Horrible. It shows that things can change quickly and for the worse as this virus mutates. So far, the vaccines have been amazingly effective, even with all the known variants, but we need to get them distributed fast and globally before even newer variants appear that may escape the vaccines. And while you or I can't do much to speed up vaccine distribution, there is something we can do, and that is we can get vaccinated. Mutations occur much more easily in non-vaccinated populations. So please, everyone, go get your vaccine. I got mine. The risks of the vaccines are minuscule, whereas the risks of COVID are not minuscule. But enough of that. Let's just get right into it. Here is my interview with Matthew Baggott. Hi, Matthew. It's really good to see you again. I haven't seen you in a long time. Hope you've been safe during the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you, and it's really great to be on your podcast. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. It's going to be a good one. So I decided to interview you when I found out you started a new company called Tactogen, right? Yeah, and your goal is to find new entactogen-like drugs, MDMA-like drugs. And I wanted to start off asking a bit about that sort of in a challenging kind of way, because I've always been somewhat critical of the sort of medical search for alternative psychedelics. A lot of that has been coupled with what I've always seen as a misguided search for therapeutic psychedelics without the psychedelic component, as if they're trying to remove the acute effects in order maybe to make them more palatable to mainstream conservatives, not understanding that the acute effects are essential for the therapeutic benefit. Or in the case of MDMA, maybe searching for a less neurotoxic entactogen. But as we've spoken about many times, the neurotoxic effects of MDMA may not be as big of a deal as people are making it out to be. And also, how can you really up MDMA in its therapeutic value, like a pure serotonin releaser, right? So my question is, like, what new features of entactogens are you trying to discover and why?
That's a great question. So first of all, I largely agree with you. I think that psilocybin and MDMA and LSD are therapeutic and valuable and safe enough right now. The thing is, though, is that especially for MDMA, there are some kind of side effects that we don't really want. One of them would be the short-term hypertension that you get for just a few hours after taking it. And for most people, that's not a big deal. And so this happens, maybe 5% of people who get 125 milligrams of MDMA will have a systolic blood pressure over 180 millimeters mercury. If you're healthy, if your body's used to exercising, no big deal. But there's a lot of people out there for whom that's not going to be true. A lot of people have hypertension to start with and, maybe have a history of cardiovascular problems. And that's going to turn out to be a lot of people, partly because mental illness or depression is often comorbid with other conditions. If you're struggling with your mental health, you're also often struggling with your physical health. And so like hypertension is much more common in people with post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. And so it'd be nice to have something that didn't raise your blood pressure as much. Another thing that I'm worried about, and that, it's been a source of disappointment to me that we haven't, as a group of scientists, really fully understood this over the years, is this loss of magic phenomenon. And we don't quite understand the mechanism, but if you're a patient and you're just getting MDMA 3 times for post-traumatic stress disorder, this isn't really an issue. But in a world in which Tactogens, MDMA, and maybe other medicines become available to you for therapeutic use across your life, a lot of people are going to get to the point where they've been treated with MDMA to accelerate their psychotherapy and self-understanding several times, and they'll start to get diminishing effects from the medicine.
I'm one of them.
Yeah, there you go. And so if we can find a way to prevent that, that would be enormously valuable, I think.
Or a new drug that I could take that has all that magic again.
Exactly, yeah.
Of course, if you patent that, then you're going to make a lot of money off of me. You'll give me some freebies, right? Just because of our history and friendship, yeah.
I mean, absolutely. But all joking aside, the company is a public benefit corporation. And our goal is to not just develop new medicines, but also find a way to amplify the good things in the psychedelic community and ensure that they don't get left behind when we medicalize.
I want to ask you, I got a whole bunch of questions to you about that. That really involves this whole psychedelic renaissance and capitalism making forays into it. And it's really the hot topic and a lot of controversy right now. And your company is a little bit different. You've been in the underground culture and the professional culture for a long time. But before we do that, let's talk a little more specifics about the blood pressure. Isn't the blood pressure increase related simply to a secondary dopamine or norepinephrine effect from the serotonin stimulation? And so 2 questions in that. Number 1 is, couldn't you just take a beta blocker to sort of reduce those mild effects? And number 2, if you were trying to find a therapeutic drug that didn't have such serotonin binding, it wouldn't be as therapeutic. It wouldn't have as much of the relaxation and authenticity, emotional feelings that are responsible for that benefit. So how do you expect? I mean, you're going to hire scientists and try to figure this out. Like on a technical level, what are you looking for a Tactogen that can't or won't increase blood pressure?
Sure. Great question. So we do think that the acute hypertension is going to have a number of mechanisms. One of them is going to be probably stimulation of peripheral receptors causing vasoconstriction. But a big important driver is probably going to be norepinephrine release. Mm-hmm. And if you look at alpha-ethyltryptamine, so alpha-ethyltryptamine is a tryptamine that was briefly explored as an antidepressant, and it has some of the MDMA-like qualities in higher doses. And so it's been used for this kind of purpose. Probably less consistent emotional effects than MDMA, though. It lacks the hypertensive effect. Uh-huh. It doesn't seem to really release norepinephrine, and it doesn't seem to really release your blood pressure.
But it has an MDMA-like entactogenic effect.
It does. I think people would argue that it isn't quite as emotionally supportive, and the emotional effects might be more variable. And so I think, getting back to your point, we're likely going to have to make some kind of trade-offs. And so one of the lessons we've learned over the past few decades is that there's a lot of medicines or a lot of chemicals that will have some of the MDMA quality. And, we've seen 4-MMC become temporarily really popular. We've seen some benzofurans become popular. And a lot of these do have this close family resemblance to MDMA while having their own unique aspects. And so that really supports the idea that this is not something where MDMA is really the only thing, but that there's going to be ones that have more or less of these different qualities. And so it's fully possible that the molecules we find, while being less hypertensive, might also give you a little less emotional support. And that might mean that they're not really great for people that are going to go really deep into really dark spaces. It might not be the best medicine for post-traumatic stress disorder. But we think that there's still going to be a lot of people who would benefit from something a little less intense, a little more gentle, because all they're trying to do is, work through some issues in therapy, reconnect with a partner, or, any of a number of other indications. And so, essentially, we think that you can make some trade-offs and still remain in a very valuable therapeutic space.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I never really thought of it the way that you were kind of describing it now, that there could be sort of gentler or more moderate entactogens for people who may have a risk in taking MDMA. How do you plan to discover these? Is the idea to tweak molecules the way Sasha did and then test them on people, like test them on animals first? How are you going to go about sort of discovering or inventing, whatever you want to call it, these new drugs with these new qualities?
So what we've done so far is we built a machine learning predictive model that predicts the activity of molecules. And
Holy cow, you have? You built?
Yes.
And this is because now there's so much data out there with Sasha and other like trip reports on air. Where did you get the data to feed the algorithm? So
there's a number of data sets that are just about how does a molecule interact with the serotonin transporter or the dopamine or the norepinephrine transporter. And so we can use those to build models that will essentially predict where the molecule is in what you might call like a sort of abstract space of how dopaminergic versus serotonin versus norepinephrine versus other specific receptors. And once you do that, you can try and find molecules that are in the space close to MDMA.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you didn't even need subjective trip reports to kind of come up with some of these possibilities?
Not directly, but what we do use trip reports for is understanding how far away you can move from MDMA in any direction and what it'll feel like. And so you might be interested in the ratio of dopamine release to serotonin release. And when they become pretty even, like no matter how much dopamine you're releasing, it doesn't really feel that much like a stimulant anymore. And so like 4-bromomethcathinone kind of has a sort of hard to pin down antidepressant-like quality about it because of that. And so understanding, is this going to feel grounding and authentic and less neurotic the way MDMA does, or is this going to feel exciting and energizing and moreish, the way a stimulant does?
Like cocaine.
And understanding that. Exactly, yes.
Wow, that's fascinating. I had no idea. So you've actually you must have hired some, machine language mathematicians, programmers to do this. You already did that part, and you actually you have some candidates now. New drugs no one's ever ingested that you're ready to kind of feed to people and see what happens?
Yes, we're not quite ready to feed them to people because there's a whole bunch of safety work you want to do first.
Right.
But yes, so in my previous role was at Genentech, which was the first biotech startup ever and is now owned by Hoffman LaRoche. And I ran a team of data scientists and data engineers there. And so, having worked in industry doing these sorts of data science projects, it was something that I could basically do on my own. And I also have a network of people that I can bring in as consultants to help me build it out. And so right now it's essentially me, and I've got 3 different data scientists that do some work on the project.
Wow, that's great. I must say I'm very excited about that. I'll be one of your volunteers. If you need volunteers that barely feel an MDMA effect anymore because you're looking for the one that can bring that magic back, make sure you give me a call.
Absolutely.
And so, like, where do you think the market is for these. And are you envisioning a MAPS-like model where these drugs will only be administered in a clinic, or are you hoping that there might even be pharmacy access to some of them? What is the market you're thinking your new compounds will reach?
So our goal is to develop medicines that are gentle enough that you could use them as take-home prescription medicines. And so they'll have to be prescribed by your doctor. So you go in, you get a prescription, and maybe your physician writes a prescription for one pill to take at home. And we're still going to need to work out what are the range of activities that'll still give you therapeutic results. We think that certainly working in the room with a therapist is going to be something that gives you positive results. Mm-hmm. But we think that there's going to be a lot of other activities. And if we can show those in experiments, we think that we can get approval for a much broader range of activities. If you're not concerned about hypertension and your drugs are sort of relatively gentle, we think that we can get FDA approval for this kind of take-home usage. And what this would mean is you can potentially have people who are currently working as underground therapists be people that you work with. So it'll be prescribed by some doctor, but then you'll be able to go and work with the person of your choice.
Or even your regular therapist. They don't even have to know that you're on this drug that's enhancing your therapeutic experience with them, right?
I mean, I think you could do that. I wouldn't recommend lying to your therapist. And I think that at this point, because it's a prescription medicine, that you would probably not have difficulty finding a therapist who's open to that, because it would be perfectly legal.
This is a little bit of a new sort of field here, right? There are some drugs that are prescribed as needed. You know, like my sister gets Xanax when she flies, right? That kind of a thing. But this would be like sort of that model. Maybe you get 3 pills and you're told like what circumstances are best to take them, that kind of a thing. Do you really think the FDA is at a point now, or we will get to a point where even sort of mild happy drugs are going to be so non-controlled that they'll be able to be prescribed the way you're talking about? Are you concerned about them developing a sort of recreational black market and incurring the wrath of the drug war as a result?
So first of all, I don't think we're there yet, but I think that we may well be there in a few years after MDMA is approved as a prescription drug and we as a society get experience with it. Having something that is not as intense and probably not as fun, but which still has enough of the value, is going to seem pretty non-threatening to the system. And of course, this is going to be dependent on us collecting the data to support that this stuff is still therapeutic. But certainly, as you just said, we as a society have accepted use benzodiazepines as needed for people who need them. And so it's there's a lot of potential for a very similar model.
Fascinating. Well, this is a good place maybe to segue into the discussion of the just an enormous number of new startups trying to enter the psychedelic market and patent drugs or patent processes of doing psychedelic assisted therapy. You are a public benefit corporation, and presumably you aren't just in this for profit. I mean, how can you make a profit on a drug you're only going to prescribe 1 to 3 times? This is why MAPS' model is also a PBC. So before we get into kind of the patent shenanigans with Compass Pathways and Camtech and other companies, just in general, how do you see your corporation being able to make enough money while also providing a public good in this way? And how are you going to compete, with these other for-profit companies? What's the difference in your model?
So we're taking an approach of developing something that isn't a classical psychedelic, and isn't really competing with that sort of therapeutic benefit. And so by classical psychedelic, I mean something that stimulates the 5-HT2A receptor and is more like a psilocybin or an LSD. We think that those sorts of medicines are going to be decriminalized locally in many places, and it'll become easy to grow your own mushrooms. And if you don't want to grow it yourself, it'll be easy to obtain it. And if your specific state or city doesn't have that kind of option, you can probably travel just a few hours to get it. So that's going to happen and be something that's going to really change the calculations for these psychedelic startups. What we're doing in developing synthetic molecules that are Tactogens that have this MDMA-like therapeutic benefit is something that will probably be complementary to those kinds of experiences. And we think it's also going to be complementary to MDMA in the sense that you may need MDMA's power for working through some kinds of issues, but between MDMA sessions, or maybe even before your first session, to get a taste of this kind of thing, or to further integrate the work, then our sorts of medicine might be valuable. And so we don't really see competition per se in this space. And that's one of the reasons that we're focused on encouraging a healthy ecosystem where there's different options for different people. And the good things in the psychedelic underground continue to grow and continue to help people.
Like one of the fears is that these companies, they don't understand the psychedelic underground and that they actually see us as a competitor, right? You mentioned that they are going to have competition when decriminalization hits. I mean, that's really it. Like, it's not in Compass Pathways' interest to see mushrooms decriminalized in every state, because why would anyone pay $1,000 or whatever to go to a therapist to get shrooms when they can get them anywhere and do them at home with their family or friends? So, so there's a lot of controversy, maybe even animosity now towards some of these companies. What's your prediction about their success or failure given the new decriminalization landscape that we're seeing?
So before I answer that, which is a good question, I want to say that the optimistic view of this would be that companies that are trying to develop classic psychedelics will face downward price pressures from competition. But there are still going to be people who want the psychedelics in a clinical setting, who want it to be something prescription with a doctor there and that kind of stuff.
Sure.
And so that model is going to appeal to a lot of people. And if you think about, just the population who has depression and anxiety issues in the United States, it's almost 20% of the population.
A lot more over this last year.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so again, there really are more patients than any of these companies is going to be able to handle in the near future, because there's going to be bottlenecks not in the demand from people. The bottlenecks will be in the number of trained therapists that can actually dispense the medicine. And so if you're a for-profit psychedelic company, your model would go something like this. You apply for a patent on hopefully a brand new molecule. If you can't get a brand new molecule, you get a new use for an old molecule. If you can't get a new use for an old molecule, you get a new way of packaging and delivering the molecule. And so essentially you can write patents that get sort of smaller and smaller and thus less and less valuable. But a lot of the patents applications you're hearing about are these sorts of very narrowly written patent applications. And the companies writing them are doing that just to try and get a little slice of turf, but also banking on the fact that most people don't drill down to see what the actual patent is about. And so they hear that some company has applied for a patent, and in most cases they haven't gotten them. They're announcing they've applied, and nobody really drills down to see what the thing is. And they're like, oh no, this company has a patent for, cannabinoids and tryptamines. And usually it's a patent application not yet awarded, and usually it's for a pill that combines the two, not for the idea of combining the two, which of course already existed.
Yeah.
And so So if you're a company, you try to get some sort of patent like this. And if you're a legit company actually trying to bring something to market, you think about this in terms of a patent lasts 20 years. It usually takes you at least 5 years to get the medicine approved and on the market. 5 is really fast. It could be as long as 10, but you'd like it to be 5. Because if it's 5, it leaves you 15 years to make money off of it before you lose the patent and it becomes something that is generic. And so in that 15 years, your goal is to prescribe it to as many people as possible or to write as many prescriptions as possible. And there's tactics where you could try and find an indication where there's a lot of people, and then you don't have to have each person have that many experiences with your medicine. Or you can try and do something where you find something where people will want to take it regularly, like a microdosing type model. And so then you can serve fewer people, but still have a lot of dispensing take place. Mm-hmm. And so for these companies to really make a profit, they need to have the market be big, have there be a lot of therapists who can work with the medicine, assuming that they're doing a therapy model and not like a microdosing model.
Yep.
And just make a lot of money in those first few years, which could be as long as 15, but often it's closer to 10. Like if you look at MindMed, they have an 18-MC patent that they licensed from an older company. So 18-MC is an ibogaine derivative that seems to have an anti-craving effect without the psychedelic effect.
Oh, interesting.
And so this could be something that you could use for a lot of substance abuse issues, or potentially overeating, or
is that just with opioids or any cravings?
The animal data suggested that it could help with any cravings.
That's really interesting. Okay, that's a whole nother issue.
So, but the point with 18-MC is that patent that they've licensed is going to expire in 2 years. And so, they're going to try to file other patents and extend that one. But the basic idea of using 18-MC to treat substance abuse problems is going to become public domain in 2 years.
Interesting.
And so if you imagine their situation, if they could get it to market today, they could make money for 2 years, and then other people could potentially enter the market. And so that's, assuming that a company really wants to bring the thing to market. And so if you're going to bring it to market, what you want is a big population of people that know about the medicine, that are asking their doctors for it. And you want a big population of people who know how to work with it, therapists or other healthcare providers. And that ecosystem largely doesn't exist today.
MAPS is the only one that's really been building that, right?
Well, I think that was initially true, but it's not quite true anymore. CIIS and a couple other schools have programs. There's a startup named Fluence that has some very experienced psychedelic therapists behind it that is doing training. And, the big startups like Compass have also been training therapists.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
But it's still going to be not enough to meet the demand. If you just looked at MDMA, PTSD affects almost 9 million people in any given year. And if you're a new revolutionary medicine, you might capture 10% of the market in your first year, just based on demand and people want to switch. But in this case, it'll probably be even more than 10% of that 9 million people. And that would require, to just treat those 10%, something like 35 or 36,000 therapists, which we're not going to have by that time.
Yeah, right.
And so, in terms of these companies making money off their patents, it's going to be complicated and limited by the bottleneck of therapists. And this is all assuming that the companies legitimately want to bring a medicine to market. Probably a large number of these companies are, they're open to that possibility, but they're also mostly focused on how the people who started the company can make their exit with a lot of money.
They're just paying themselves now and getting stocks and then trying to sell them before things fail, huh?
Yep. It's like, this is a bubble. There's been like $600 million going into psychedelic startups in the last 6 months.
Do you think Compass people involved in that are expecting and planning for there to be a bubble and they're just trying to get rich and drop out before it collapses?
I don't have any special insight into them. Peter Thiel has a reputation of investing in companies that he thinks could possibly be a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be evidence that they're actually going for it and that they're going to play hardball.
And they're patenting every type of therapeutic widget the practice they can, including holding hands with the patient, having a comfortable chair, even making a home-like environment. Things you'd think would be impossible to patent. They're trying to patent them, and that could be indication they're really playing hardball too.
Absolutely, and that's to be clear, that's a patent application.
Uh-huh.
And so it hasn't been awarded, and I don't think it's even been assigned an examiner in the United States. And so we haven't started the process here, but that was a process that they started worldwide. And so, it was published last October. And so there's still some time before we start to work through it within the US.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very unlikely that they'll get most of what they're trying to patent in that application. But it's a bad sign in terms of where their head's at, that they're even trying to do that.
Right. And what about their patenting of not psilocybin itself, obviously, but particular ways of making it? Are they trying to patent these methods to make it harder for other companies to be able to synthesize it on their own?
Again, I don't know their motivations or their strategy. I think a lot of companies, if they came up with a new manufacturing method, would patent it.
Sure. So it was just one method that their own. That's the only one they patented.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they also have a patent on a specific polymorph, which is a crystalline form of psilocybin. And again, this is the kind of thing that if you have a new molecule, you patent the molecule. If you don't have a new molecule, you try to patent some unique version of the molecule. And so this is that. So there's still going to be psilocybin out there. And of course, USANA is a nonprofit company that's developing psilocybin as a medicine.
Right.
And they're continuing along.
Right. All right, let's going back. So you're saying most of these companies need, in order to profit, to have a lot of therapists ready and able to provide the therapy to patients. And then that may not be there. So by the time the patents run out. So could be a sticking point. But whereas your company is looking to do something different in having these be prescription medications. So you don't really need those therapists to be there under your model. Yes.
So for these other companies that will have a bottleneck of therapists. And again, you don't have this bottleneck if you're doing a microdosing model where it's essentially like a classic antidepressant,
yep,
which can be used without therapy. But if your goal is to do psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, then these first wave of companies, this first generation of companies, is going to try to find ways to reduce the spend of the therapy session. And so this is going to mean we're going to see group therapy becoming a popular thing.
Mm.
We're also going to see companies trying to use technological tools to assist, or even in some cases possibly replace the therapist.
Right.
Now, we largely don't think that as a company, Tactogen needs to solve these problems, because we're going to come to market, optimistically 7 years from now. And by that time, there will be a lot of therapists who are trained and experienced. And so even if we only pursued the same psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy model, the second generation of medicines aren't really going to have the same bottleneck that the first generation did. And that's partly why one of our big interests is, even though we're not close to bringing anything to market, we're really interested in how can we contribute to the healthy ecosystem that will allow the good things in the psychedelic culture to stay here and to grow.
Great. And that's why, I love talking to you. You have had one foot in each world, and you have, gone to Burning Man. You've been a part of the psychedelic culture before it became professionalized and respected, and understand its value, even its therapeutic value, because my big thing's always been that the relegation of mental health to couch and a stranger, psychedelic assisted or not, isn't the best method of improving mental health, because mental health is so much a part of our community, our social structures. And so I actually think that taking psychedelics in festivals, at raves, or house parties is probably more therapeutic for a greater number of people than the medical model. And, your company may actually have room to where people could use them that way. And that's honoring the culture and the community aspect of the psychedelic community alliance. And so I really appreciate that. I'm glad you're in this business competing with some of these other guys.
Thanks. Yeah. It's absolutely a mistake to think that the psychological struggles that we have are something that can be adequately addressed on the individual level. The root cause of a lot of this isn't just, your personal trauma, but it's that you're embedded in a system that doesn't give you enough support for you to fully thrive and actually work through these issues.
Right.
And so we really do need a broader vision of what we're trying to build here. And so we like to say that our goal isn't just to medicalize psychedelics, but to psychedelicize medicine. And to realize that the integration work and the connection with other people and the connection with healthy processes afterwards is as important or more important than just the experience.
Yeah.
And so we also don't think that this is something that we can solve or should try to solve as a company of essentially two people right now. And so we're really focused on trying to find ways to be permeable to the community, to find people who are stakeholders and bring them in as shareholders, and to make this more of a community project so that we ensure we're solving the right problems and building the right kind of things.
I would take it even a step further and say that a lot of the therapeutic value in psychedelics, particularly the Tactogens, isn't even its ability to help you work through issues, but rather simply the positive social experiences that you have on them while you're on them. Because, in my years of working with young people, talking to young people in raves and festivals about their psychedelic use, healing from their trauma is one thing that people often tell me, but probably even more so is what I like to call kind of the proud nerd effect. And that is a lot of young people are kind of maybe a little bit on the spectrum, kind of math nerds, geeks who are extremely shy and have a lot of social anxiety. They end up taking MDMA in a party environment and for the first time in their life, feeling comfortable in their own skin. And I've had people tell me, yeah, I was never able to tell a girl they were pretty before, And so it's not even that they've got trauma or things they have to intellectualize about why they have social anxiety. Suddenly, they don't have it anymore, and they develop a social life that lasts even when they're not on the drug. Like their personalities transform simply because they're having these positive experiences. So Tactogens are healthy in and of themselves in the ways that they can produce social bonding.
I would agree. And there's a couple things to unpack there. One is that Tactogens give you this sympathetic connection with your authentic self. And this can allow you to, it's not necessarily working through trauma. Sometimes it's just setting aside trauma and saying that, it happened, it's okay, I'm okay. And then that's the self-connection. And then Tactogens can really help you with this social connection and connecting with other people. And once you've done that once, you realize how positive a thing it is to be social and open in this kind of way. And it becomes easier to develop life practices that sustain this sort of healthy interaction with other people. And I think that festivals like music festivals or like Burning Man are a good example of this kind of positive social event where you can kind of set aside some of your day-to-day worries and have a positive experience with other people. And that's absolutely enormously healthy.
I think so. I missed them. My last episode was about when our festival's going to happen again.
Yeah,
I almost
I read
cried during it. Did you listen?
I read your little summary of
the
it.
transcript, yeah. All right, what do you think about Camtech? They did receive their patent on combining cannabis with psilocybin, right?
My understanding is that it's considered patentable, but it hasn't been awarded. So they've gone through some back and forth with the patent office, and there's no clear reason to exclude the application. And so it seems likely to be awarded. And again, this is something where it's combining two molecules into a single package, which potentially gives you convenience, but it potentially has some downsides because you can't titrate the individual doses. And this is going to be, maybe something that people who take cannabinoids will care about a lot, because your preferred dose of, whether it's THC or CBD is going to vary a lot. And so whether that patent ends up being worth anything really depends on whether another company wants to license it or whether Camtech wants to bring a product to market. Right. And so, that individual patent, if awarded, might not be that valuable, because you could still have, one capsule with cannabinoids in it or THC in it, another capsule with a tryptamine in it, and then you pick the dose that's best for you and the timing that's best for you and take those together.
But it would be illegal to pour them into the same capsule and swallow them.
I mean, it would be illegal to sell it. I think it would be violating
because the patent.
But patent holders don't tend to go after individuals because there's no real money in it, and so this would prevent marketing. And again, this is something that it's assuming that this is convenience is largely something that you want for the consumer market, and so this is assuming that we'll get to the point where there's widespread consumer sales of these kinds of things.
Yeah, one thing I'm learning in this conversation here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sounding like all these patents, all these for-profit companies coming into the psychedelic culture trying to make money on psychedelic therapy, they're competing with one another, but there really doesn't seem, after talking to you, to be much of a threat to the underground culture. A lot of the psychedelic community that's been using psychedelics, even in sort of more official underground therapy type settings, have been really alarmed and worried about the incursions of the for-profit companies. But just the fact that there's the market's so big for them and there's so few paid therapists, and they're not, even if you patented psilocybin, you can't stop mushrooms from growing, right? Is it true? Do you agree that there's really no threat to the availability of the classic psychedelics that has been growing over the last decade? We are at a height of availability of psychedelics, and that's not going to go away. And the underground psychedelic culture is going to continue to thrive despite these for-profit companies getting involved. Do you think that's true?
I think it's mostly true. So I don't think that decriminalization is going to be halted, no matter how much a company would like to do that. And so I think that if you're a company that's trying to develop psilocybin and you're for profit, you might really like there to be no place where you can legally take psilocybin. But that's not going to happen, for the same reason that we're not going to see a rollback of loosening of cannabis regulations. And that's that once local governments find a new tax stream, it's really hard for them to give it up. And so the horse has left the stable. This is not going to be something that gets rolled back. But I do think that there is a worrisome misalignment between some of these companies and this broader trend of decriminalization. And so there may well be some friction there, particularly at the federal level. But is not going to undo what's happening. Mm-hmm. The thing that I am more concerned about is we're in a moment of possibility where we can build something new and better. And so during this moment, how can we create new systems where the psychedelic underground gets legitimized and de-risked? And so people are going to be able to continue to grow their mushrooms. You can just buy some pre-cooked rice from Uncle Ben's brand and inject spores into it, and you're like 80% of the way there.
Is that organic, Uncle Ben?
It's probably not organic, no. But it's the cheapest, easiest way to do this because it's pre-sterilized, and so you don't need to worry about sterilization for the most part. So you can just do that kind of thing. But if you want to, hang out a shingle and say, I'm going to see people, I'm going to have clients, and I'm going to work with them, then you start to get at risk again.
Right.
And so how can we create a system where people can legitimately open for business, be open about it, make a reasonable living at it, and have insurance and all the other kinds of things that you need to be professional?
Those are the people that may be impacted by Compass and other for-profit companies, make entry into that too difficult.
Well, it's not even that they might make entry too difficult. It's that we need advocates that are trying to create the legal system for these sorts of practices.
Yeah.
And by default, it's not going to necessarily happen.
Yeah. It's a tough one. I had one underground psychedelic therapist tell me just last week after the Compass patent application came out, she said, I'm done with it. She was pursuing getting certified and eventually going overground, but she's like, forget it. I'm just going to stick with my underground practice right now. She doesn't have faith that she's going to be able to make as much money or even do what she wants to do with her clients the way she's doing it. So, she's giving up on it.
And I think that's reasonable right now. Like, if I were her, I might well keep my head down for a while too. Mm-hmm. But hopefully we'll have some opportunities, and we'll carve out into the new system places for people who've been doing this kind of work. Because if you think about it, our most experienced healers right now are people that don't have any kind of official status and aren't necessarily going to have any role in the new system. And that's just terrible.
Yeah, really. There's a more broader issue of just sort of the psychedelic identity. The psychedelic culture forever has been an underground culture. People have identified with it as rebels, largely left, anti-war, anti-imperial. The, prohibition of psychedelics has tended to identify them with the left a bit more. People less conservative, more willing to break laws, for example. And a lot of the animosity right now towards the for-profit companies coming in has been around sort of a loss of self-identity for a lot of people. There's a lot of right-wingers now. We got the Mercers donating to MEPS. We've got Peter Thiel investing in Compass. We have tech professionals talking about microdosing, making them more competitive so they can get richer and presumably advance faster than other people. A capitalist competition. It's not the one love and everyone support each other kind of cultural identity. Where people are feeling that their culture and their identification with that is getting subverted by the mainstreaming of psychedelics. For example, there's a lot of ways in which pharmaceuticals selling drugs, particularly psych drugs, will not just exaggerate the benefits of their drugs, but also exaggerate the prevalence of the disease, even creating new diseases in order to sell their drugs. Almost like trying to convince people they're sick and that they need to do this. It's like there's just some way in which it's kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth, how psychedelics and capitalism, and particularly a for-profit medical system, right? A for-profit medical system are kind of coming together culturally. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Absolutely. First, in terms of companies finding indications and maybe finding indications that weren't really things before. I'm kind of sympathetic to that, to be honest. Particularly within psychiatry, the DSM-5, it's not really like a purely empirically derived system of classifying the ways that people have mental suffering. It's a historic document that has been fought over within the industry, and it's trying to be sort of a compromise between different views. And it, like the ICD-10, the European system, is used in some ways primarily for billing. Like if you're actually a therapist working with clients, it's not necessarily super important what code you write down for the client in terms of billing them. And it's just like, at one point in my life, I was having some ankle problems, and I went to a doctor, and they were like, oh, well, we could get you prescription inserts, but they're not covered unless we diagnose you in this way, and then you can get coverage for your inserts. Uh-huh. And so to some extent, I think the system is like that. The system has been set up where FDA will approve medicines if they're for a disorder, and FDA won't approve medicines if they're just to make your life more meaningful and fuller and more enjoyable and healthier.
Right.
And so if we think that there are things that have that kind of potential, we're still going to need to come up with an indication, and the indication is going to need to make sense in terms of the economics of it and its measurability in studies so that you can show your medicine works. And so that's like a lot of strategic stuff for how do we build a better world.
Okay, but I was really talking about the cultural implications of this, because that all may be true. But it's like when you see advertisements for, and which we're going to see, like on TV probably coming up real soon, people suffering from PTSD looking all sad and MDMA can help and all this. Like it shifts the cultural identification of MDMA towards this medicine that you use when you're sick, and strips away from it the original cultural connotation of MDMA, the rave culture, which was plur, peace, love, unity, respect, and fun. And the fact these are recreational drugs that we love to take and bond with our friends, and it's super fun. And now suddenly, it's like capitalism is kind of ruining it. I think people are really upset at the stripping away of their cultural identity. You're a neuroscientist, but just not your area of expertise. But if you were trying to talk to someone who is upset about that, what would you say to them? Is this just something we have to live with?
I have huge sympathy for that view, and I identify with it a lot. I think it's a more general phenomenon. I like the band The Mountain Goats, and when I started seeing them, it would be just one guy singing and playing guitar, and then a few tours later he added a bass player, and it would be in a room of maybe 100 people. Uh-huh. And now you hear their music on the end credits of HBO shows and things like that. Uh-huh. And it's you go and see him at the Fillmore or a major venue in your city, and that sort of experience has happened to me repeatedly. Where I find something, I fall in love with it, and the same things that make me fall in love with it make other people fall in love with it, and it becomes more popular. And of course, capitalism is always watching for something that they can commodify. As Frederick Jameson said, capitalism is a totalizing system. It will try to and succeed in incorporating everything into it.
Right.
And so, for those of us who were around and remember, dance parties in the Redwoods or on a beach, these underground events, or who went to Burning Man in 1996, like I did. Of course, you go back in, I last went in, I think, 2016 or 17. Of course, you go back and it's completely changed. And you're like, this is, a lot's been lost. But if you look around, there's a lot of people who weren't there then and for whom this is the baseline, and they're being amazed.
Yep.
And so, so I think this is going to happen. And the question is, what do we do about it? And, partly, I think that it's important to see this as a general pattern that will play out throughout everyone's lives. And the question is, what can we do to make this whole thing better? And I think that we as a society really tend to lionize and look up to innovation versus maintenance. And I think when you get to the point in your life where you see good things changing and growing, the question is, how can you come in and help maintain the good things? Yeah. And so, it's just like so many other things where you move to a neighborhood and it's a hip neighborhood, and then the unhip people move in and there starts to be Starbucks displanting the mom and pop coffee shops, or whatever the phenomenon is. And at that point, obviously the thing for you to do is to shop at the mom and pop coffee shops,
right?
And also get involved in local politics and go to the meetings and events and see, how you can use your time and your money to the extent that you have that to continue to maintain the good stuff. And that's, I think, what we should be doing right now with psychedelic culture.
Right. I think another phenomenon happening is a lot of people used to think that psychedelics had some inherent liberalizing effect on people, and they were hoping that by advocating for psychedelics and that the legalization of them, that it could sort of heal the political divide and make people more tolerant and xenophobia and racism. And then they're seeing now that that's not really going to happen, particularly because there's a lot of people on the far right who are literally self-identified Nazis who are embracing psychedelics. So there's a letdown, maybe a loss of naivety. I know I had to go through that a little bit myself. There's a way in which the empathy from MDMA, if you're doing it with somebody, you can connect personally, but it doesn't really change your sort of core political beliefs. Or if you're a conservative person, generally, you're not going to become liberal or vice versa, I think, for the most part, from psychedelics of any sort. So we have to let go of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And going back to your earlier point, for us, the counterculture that really became big in the 60s seems like, a good thing. It was right about so many things, right about all the wars it opposed. It was right about all the food and music and cultural things that it championed. But if you were living in San Francisco in 1966, before the Summer of Love, and you went to Haight-Ashbury, it was a really interesting place with, political experimentation, living life as art, lots of free music and stuff like that. And then essentially the formation of the idea of the counterculture in the mainstream media, and then, the counterculture as a lifestyle that you could purchase, that kind of ended a lot of the good stuff because it just got crowded out and people moved away, and you no longer had Haight-Ashbury as a nodal point of innovation. And so even though we think, this was a good thing, the growth of this really did kind of end a lot of even better stuff that just wasn't scalable and sustainable, or it didn't have people kind of with enough power and resources to hold down the space and maintain it.
Now, you're not old enough to remember this personally. How did you learn this? Did you read something?
Yeah, so this is a whole side thing, but I've done a lot of research on the history of psychedelics, and including interviewing some of the people that were there then. I've been particularly interested in DOM, or STP as it was called when it was released onto the street, and exactly how that happened.
Was it the CIA?
Because no, it wasn't. It was Owsley Stanley, Bear, the famous psychedelic chemist who was an early patron of the Grateful Dead and paid for some of their equipment, and then became their genius sound man, although he was an extremely difficult person to work with. He released DOM into the world as kind of an experiment, and the experiment mostly failed. Yeah, but it's essentially an example of substituting a lesser studied drug for a well-known safer drug because of regulations. And so it was an attempt to handle the fact that LSD was being made illegal. And they're like, well, let's just come up with something else that's a legal version of LSD.
Right.
And of course, it
a bad substitute. Yeah.
Yeah, it was not a good substitute. It like lasted much longer. It had a weird non-linearity to the dosing where, small increases would cause it to last a whole lot longer. And, it scared people. And, the medical system at the time didn't really know how to handle it. So it's really interesting.
Blood pressure increases too.
Absolutely, yeah. Probably mostly from the vasoconstriction thing we talked about earlier.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, interesting. Wow, we got to do another podcast on the history of psychedelics then. I'll bring you back on.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Any last thing you want to say that we haven't touched on?
I think we're, in perilous times right now in terms of how things will develop, but there are also times of a lot of possibility. And I think that if people hold down the space, hold on to and try and grow the good things, I think we can come up with something really transformative for our culture and for the world. And so I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic here if we put in the time and do the work. And so, as I said, I think that there was maybe $600 million that went into this space in the last 6 months. And my company is slightly more than 1 million of those dollars. And
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And, we're trying to do good things with it. There's other companies that I think are good out there. Journey Collab, I think, is really interesting. They're trying to develop mescaline as a treatment for alcohol use disorders. And they're really trying to do it in a way that's respectful to the communities that have traditionally used peyote. And they're trying to be very community-based and almost like a co-op kind of model in terms of how they treat the people involved in the system. So they're great to check out. Of course, the nonprofits that have been in this space, like Arrowhead or like the Hefters and like MAPS are really worth supporting. And we're now starting to see lots of interesting professional organizations. If you're like at all related to healthcare, there may well be a psychedelic professional organization that you can get involved with as well. And so this is a time of a lot of possibility, and I think it's worth being hopeful for it. But it's not going to happen automatically. So, get involved.
My main issue I'm going to keep pushing for is decriminalization, because I think that's the backbone of this. But let's say there are people out there with money and want to give to your company. Where can they find you?
So my website is tactogen.com. That's Tactogen.com. And at the bottom of the website, you can add your name to our mailing list, and we're eventually going to start sending out news. One of the things that we're going to try and do is find ways to be permeable to the community, to pull people in and get them involved. And so it'll be not just your typical company, updates about our progress, but also more socially aware things that we'll be trying to do. So I think it's probably worth getting involved there.
Thank you so much, Nat, for agreeing to do this interview. It's been a great pleasure, and you stay safe out there, and I hope you get your vaccine soon.
Thanks, me too. And right back at you. It's been great being on here.
All right, take it easy.